For 20 years, he had never spoken a word. Doctors had never heard his voice. But when a bomb threat came into the hospital, the old janitor's commands of Building Evacuation Protocol Alpha, exit routes secured, casualty transport procedures activated, left everyone frozen in shock. Welcome to my channel. Before we begin this powerful story of silence, leadership, and forgotten heroism, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe real warriors never forget their brothers, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The corridors of Chicago General Hospital echoed with the same silence every night, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of monitors, and the occasional squeak of rolling gurneys. But the most familiar sound started every evening at 10 p.m. sharp, the rhythmic swish of a mop hitting the floor, the gentle clink of buckets, and slow but steady footsteps. Robert Bob Williams was the night shift janitor on the hospital's third floor. For 20 years, he had cleaned the same hallways, organized the same rooms, and performed the same tasks at the same hours. But no one had ever heard his voice. The 58-year-old Bob was average height, gray-haired, and always wore the same blue work uniform. Deep lines marked his face, as if the years had quietly worn him down. A faint scar ran across his left cheek, and a strange tattoo was visible on his arm, but nobody paid attention to these details, because Bob was invisible. Young doctors passed by without looking. "Excuse me," they'd say and keep walking. Nurses talked around him as if he wasn't in the room. Family members asked him directions like he was a piece of furniture. "Where's the restroom?" Bob's desk was in a small room in the hospital basement. An old metal desk, a broken chair, and a calendar hanging on the wall. His coffee mug was cracked, but he had never complained. When he took his meal breaks, he sat alone. Even the other janitors rarely spoke with him. "Bob's a really quiet guy," they'd say among themselves. "It's like he never talks." It was true. For 20 years, he had only said good morning and good night. Nothing else. He answered questions with single words. Yes. No. Okay. That was it. But Bob heard everything. The doctors' hurried conversations, the nurses' concerns about patient conditions, the fears of worried families. He listened to it all silently, never interfering. He just did his job. Young resident doctors sometimes wondered about him. "I wonder if that guy ever talks at home," they'd ask each other. "Does he have family? Where does he come from? Where does he go?" But nobody asked Bob these questions, because he was just a janitor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a 28-year-old emergency medicine specialist. She had worked at this hospital for 3 years and saw Bob every night, but they had never spoken. Sarah sometimes wondered how he could stay so quiet. Especially during busy nights when everyone was running and shouting, Bob seemed completely unaffected as he silently went about his work. How can this man stay so calm, Sarah would think, but she never found the opportunity to ask. Or maybe it just never occurred to her to ask. March 15th, Tuesday night. 11:34 p.m. Bob was cleaning the third-floor corridors as usual. The emergency room was busy downstairs, but the third floor was peaceful. Soft breathing sounds came from patient rooms, and monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Bob was wringing out his mop, walking toward the end of the hallway. The old tattoo on his left arm was faintly visible under the fluorescent lights. Nobody knew what it meant. Bob had never explained it. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the hospital's PA system. "Attention all staff! A bomb threat has been called into the hospital. Immediate evacuation procedures are now in effect. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." The corridors suddenly burst into activity. Nurses began running around in panic. Voices rose from patient rooms. Monitors started blaring alarms. Chaos had begun. Dr. Sarah Mitchell ran from the emergency room to the third floor. Her face was slick with sweat, her hands trembling. "How are we going to evacuate the patients?" she shouted. "What about the ICU patients?" The young nurses were in full panic mode. "Do we have enough gurneys? Are the elevators working? How do we get them down the stairs?" Questions flew through the air, but there were no clear answers. That's when Bob, standing at the end of the hallway, moved. He dropped his mop, quickened his pace for the first time that night, and then he spoke. "Stop." One word. but it came out with such clarity, such authoritative tone, that everyone in the hallway froze. The voice they had never heard in 20 years was now giving commands. Bob walked straight toward them. His facial expression had changed. He was no longer the timid janitor. There was determination in his eyes, authority in his posture. "Building Evacuation Protocol Alpha is now active," he said, his voice carrying through the entire corridor. "Elevators are disabled, stairwells are secure, exit routes have been established." Dr. Sarah's mouth hung open. Was this the same man, Bob, who hadn't spoken in 20 years? "ICU patients will be evacuated first," Bob continued. "We need gurneys ready. Patients on ventilators need portable oxygen. Casualty transport procedures are active." The nurses looked at each other. How did this man know these terms? Bob continued his commands. "Doctor Mitchell, you're the emergency coordinator. Nurse Johnson, prepare the patient roster. Priority order. ICU first, then post-op, then ambulatory patients." But you're..." Dr. Sarah stammered. "Questions later," Bob said with a sharp tone. "We move now. We have 15 minutes. And at that moment, everyone began following Bob's commands. Because the authority in his voice, the confidence in his posture, and the depth of his knowledge showed that he was no ordinary janitor. Bob began organizing the hospital corridors as if it were an operational zone. His hands weren't shaking, his voice wasn't cracking. His 20 years of silence had been broken in an instant, but the man who emerged was nothing like anyone expected. "Two teams," he said, turning to the nurses. "Team Alpha, floors 1 and 2. Team Bravo, floors 3 and 4. Coordinated movement, no panic." Dr. Sarah was still in shock. "Bob, how do you know all this?" Bob looked at her. For the first time, there was warmth in his eyes. "I've dealt with similar situations before," he said briefly. Then he immediately returned to the task. "Now let's start moving patients." The evacuation began. Bob controlled everything. Which patient would be moved first, which route to use, how to maintain coordination. He knew every detail. It was as if he had been doing this job for years. "You're carrying that gurney wrong," he told a young nurse. "Head elevated, keep the airway clear." The nurse looked surprised but followed the instruction. "Going down the stairs," he added. "Feet first, head toward the back. Minimize the bouncing." Where did he learn these technical details? The hospital staff began following Bob's commands without question, because whatever he said was right, whatever he suggested worked. This man didn't just know theory, he had practical experience. The evacuation took 45 minutes. No patient was harmed, no accidents occurred. It was perfect organization. And at the center of it all was Bob, who hadn't spoken in 20 years. After the evacuation was complete, police teams searched the hospital. After a 2-hour investigation, the result was announced. The bomb threat was fake. A prank call. But the hospital staff didn't care about the prank, because that night they had discovered something else. Who was Robert Williams, really? Dr. Sarah approached Bob. He had returned to his old quiet demeanor, holding his mop. "Bob," she said in a soft voice, "what I saw tonight, who are you really?" Bob stopped. He remained silent for a long time. Then, for the first time in 20 years, he really spoke. "I used to work a different job," he said slowly. "What job?" Sarah asked. Bob looked at the tattoo on his arm, written in faded ink but still readable. 75th Ranger, 1985 to 2005. 75th Ranger Regiment, he said quietly. Army Rangers, I served for 20 years. Counter-terrorism, rescue operations, crisis management. Dr. Sarah's breath caught. The 75th Ranger Regiment, one of America's most elite units. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" she asked. A bitter smile appeared on Bob's face. "Because that life is over. Now I'm a janitor. And that's an honorable profession, too." Bob's story slowly emerged. In 1985, at age 18, he had joined the 75th Ranger Regiment. For 20 years, he had been involved in America's most difficult missions: mountain operations, hostage rescues, natural disaster responses. He had experienced every type of crisis situation. He retired in 2005. But he had struggled to adapt to civilian life, because for 20 years he had made life and death decisions every day, then suddenly had to transition to a quiet life. In the first years, I talked a lot, he told Dr. Sarah. I told stories, shared my experiences, but people got uncomfortable. They said, "Leave the old days behind." They said, "You're in civilian life now." Over time, Bob had stopped talking, because nobody wanted to listen. Nobody valued an old soldier's experiences, so he had become silent. "When I came to the hospital," he continued, "I just wanted a peaceful job, something that wouldn't hurt anyone, where no one would bother me. I would just work quietly." "But tonight," Sarah said. "Tonight there was a crisis," Bob completed. "I can't stay quiet during a crisis. 20 years of training kicks in automatically. When people's lives are in danger, my past comes out." The next day, the hospital was different. Bob came at the same time, wore the same work uniform, picked up the same mop. But he was no longer invisible. Dr. Sarah said, "Good morning, Mr. Williams." It was the first time she had called him Mr. Young doctors gave him greetings as they passed. Some even said, "Good morning, Sergeant." Nurses smiled at him. They no longer talked around him as if he wasn't there. But the biggest change was in Bob himself. He was no longer completely silent. He answered questions properly. He smiled sometimes. He even sat at the same table with other staff during lunch breaks. "Mr. Williams," said a young nurse, "I'll never forget that night. How did you stay so calm?" Bob thought about it. "Experience," he said simply. "After you've lived through real crises, fake ones become easy to recognize." "Do you have other stories?" Dr. Sarah asked. The light of memories sparkled in Bob's eyes. "Many," he said, "but some aren't good enough to tell." Days passed. Bob now held a different position in the hospital. He was still a janitor, but now he was respected. Doctors consulted him, nurses benefited from his experience. Especially the young staff learned a lot from Bob: crisis management, staying calm techniques, leadership. They learned these not from books, but from real experience. "Mr. Williams," Dr. Sarah said one day, "I wish we had known you earlier." Bob smiled. "I was always here," he said. "You just weren't looking." This statement made Dr. Sarah think. Bob really had been there all along. For 20 years he had walked the same corridors, done the same job, but nobody had looked at him. "Why didn't anyone wonder who you were?" she asked. "Because I was a janitor," Bob said simply. "People see me and only see my job, not who I am." This was a deep truth. Society defined people by their professions: doctor, nurse, engineer. These titles mattered. But janitor, that was just someone invisible. "But you never complained," Sarah said. "Because cleaning is also honorable work," Bob said. "Every job has its own value. I was just waiting for people to understand that." Months passed. Bob was now well loved in the hospital. He wasn't just cleaning, he was also mentoring young staff. He shared his experiences, providing guidance during crisis moments. Hospital management made him a special offer: security coordinator. But Bob declined. "Why?" the chief of staff asked. "Because I'm a janitor," Bob said. "I love this job. I'm just not silent anymore." And it was true. Bob now talked, laughed, told stories, but he still wore the same work uniform, used the same mop. The difference was, he was no longer invisible. The day Dr. Sarah said goodbye to him, she was transferring to another hospital. She said, "Mr. Williams, I learned so much from you. The most important thing, not to judge people by their appearances." Bob nodded. "That's one of the biggest mistakes," he said. "It's not just the part of people you see that matters, but also the part you don't see." Weeks turned into months. Bob's story spread throughout Chicago General, but he never sought recognition. He continued his night shifts, continued cleaning the same corridors with the same methodical precision. The difference was in how people saw him now. Young medical students would stop to ask him questions during their rounds. "Mr. Williams, in your experience, what's the most important thing during an emergency?" they'd ask. Bob would pause his mopping, consider the question seriously, and share wisdom that no textbook could teach. Real leadership isn't about rank, he would tell them. It's about stepping up when others step back. It's about doing what needs to be done, regardless of your job title. The hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Robert Chen, had heard about that night and made it a point to find Bob one evening. "Williams," Dr. Chen said, approaching during Bob's shift, "I've been thinking about creating a position for you. Director of Emergency Preparedness. You'd train our staff, develop protocols." Bob stopped his work, looked at the chief directly. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate the offer, but I've found my place. Sometimes the most important work happens in the background." Dr. Chen was puzzled. "But your skills, your experience, are being used every day," Bob interrupted gently. "When I train that young nurse how to properly move a patient, when I show that resident how to stay calm under pressure, when I demonstrate to security how to really observe, that's where my experience matters most." Bob's influence began extending beyond the third floor. Hospital staff started approaching situations differently. There was less panic during emergencies, better coordination during crisis drills, and most importantly, a new respect for every person working in the building. Nurse Johnson, who had worked with Bob that first night, started an informal program she called Hidden Heroes. Once a month, she would highlight a staff member whose contributions often went unnoticed: the food service worker who remembered every patient's dietary restrictions, the maintenance man who somehow always appeared when equipment failed, the parking attendant who helped families during their worst moments. "Bob taught us something important," she would say during these presentations. "Heroism doesn't always wear a uniform you can recognize. Sometimes it wears scrubs, sometimes coveralls, sometimes a janitor's outfit." Dr. Sarah, even after transferring to Northwestern Memorial, would tell Bob's story to new colleagues. It became a lesson in humility, awareness, and the danger of assumptions. One particularly busy Friday night, 3 months after the bomb threat incident, Bob was working near the ICU when alarms started blaring. A patient in room 314 was coding. As medical staff rushed in, Bob quietly moved to the hallway, but he didn't disappear like he used to. Dr. Kevin Martinez, a new resident, was leading the Code Blue team. His hands were shaking, his voice uncertain. The team was scattered, uncoordinated. Bob watched for 30 seconds, then made a decision. He stepped into the room. "Dr. Martinez," he said calmly, "take a breath. Look at your team." The young doctor paused, looked around. Bob continued. "Assign roles. Nurse, compressions, respiratory, ventilation. You coordinate. Don't do everything yourself." Within moments, the chaos organized. The team found their rhythm. The patient stabilized. Later, Dr. Martinez found Bob in the break room. "How did you know?" he asked. 20 years of high-pressure situations," Bob said. "The same principles apply whether it's a battlefield or a hospital room. Clear communication, defined roles, calm leadership. Would you be willing to teach me more?" the young doctor asked hesitantly. Bob smiled. "I teach every day. You just have to be willing to learn from someone with a mop." On the first anniversary of that March night, the hospital held a small ceremony. Not for Bob, he had specifically requested no formal recognition, but for all the unsung heroes who kept the hospital running. Bob attended in his regular work clothes, standing in the back. When Nurse Johnson spoke about that night, about leadership coming from unexpected places, about the importance of seeing every person's value, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt truly seen. After the ceremony, a young man approached him. "Mr. Williams, I'm Jake Wilson. I'm starting my residency here next month." Bob shook his hand. "Welcome to Chicago, General." "Actually," Jake continued, "Dr. Mitchell told me about you. She said you were someone I should meet. You see, I'm a veteran too, Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've been wondering how to fit into this world." Bob studied the young man's face, saw the familiar weight in his eyes, the careful way he held himself. "It's not easy," Bob said honestly. "The transition, but it's possible." "How do you do it? How do you find purpose after?" "Purpose isn't something you find," Bob said. "It's something you create. Every night I clean these floors, but I'm also watching, learning, being ready. When that moment comes, and it will come, when someone needs what you know, what you've experienced, you'll be there. Jake nodded slowly. Dr. Mitchell said you might say something like that. Smart woman, Doctor. Mitchell, Bob said. Listen, I work nights, 3rd floor. If you ever want to talk, really talk, I'm here. Robert Williams still works the night shift at Chicago General Hospital. He still cleans the same corridors with the same methodical care, but he's no longer invisible, and he's no longer silent. His story became a turning point for the hospital, a reminder that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary places. Every staff member learned to look twice, to listen more carefully, to never assume they knew someone's full story. Because that night, everyone learned a crucial lesson. Real heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they wait 20 years for someone to notice. Sometimes they push a mop until the moment comes when they're needed most. Bob's silence was earned through service, through loss, through years of carrying what others couldn't understand. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried the weight of experience that couldn't be taught in any classroom. So I ask you this, have you ever met someone like Bob? Someone who seemed ordinary but carried extraordinary experiences? Someone who served quietly, without recognition, without thanks? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they lived their quiet heroism. Say the things they would never say about themselves. We believe the most powerful stories don't shout for attention. They wait patiently to be discovered. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us make sure voices like Bob's are never truly silent again. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, if you see someone cleaning floors in a hospital, mopping halls in a school, or working quietly in any corner of your world, take a second look. You might be walking past a hero who's just waiting for someone to notice.